So just like to welcome Jürgen yet again. Always a great fan of.
Honored as always.
Always a great fan of Jürgen's work. And I think this topic is particularly interesting because we've touched on this in our own conversations, haven't we? And never really kind of discovered that you put quite a lot of store in this and really do use the best bits of these models to kind of help with your change work, and also that you haven't really shared this particularly publicly before. So we thought it'd be great to give you a flavor of Jürgen's thinking in this area and say a little bit more about kind of things that we've got planned. And I suppose that the first thing that'd be really useful if you could just tell us a little bit about what do we mean when you talk about models of development psychology? What's that all about?
Yeah, what the hell is it, and why bother? So this is a constructive developmental lens, if you will. So if we look at the various schools of psychotherapy, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or NLP or various schools of hypnotherapy and coaching, most of these today highly emphasize that we kind of co-construct our own experience, that we are storytellers. We make inferences, we interpret, we actively make meaning and construct our experience, and therefore everyone has a different experience. So this is well known. What's not so well known is that there are rather predictable stages of development, meaning-making systems, if you will, that people have a tendency to pass through if they develop as adults. In the past, if you studied developmental psychology, you would study infants and kids. There was this idea 40, 50 years ago that when people hit their early 20s, that's it. There's no more psychological development. The brain is done. But today we know, today people talk about neuroplasticity and how the brain changes itself. And like I have two kids, one who's 4 and one who's soon to be 10. And they don't just think differently. They make sense out of the world consistently in very different ways. And the kind of argument that we're making here is that 2 35-year-olds can be as different as the 4 and 10-year-old when it comes to mental complexity. And there is a lot of value in knowing something about the meaning-making stage of development that someone seems to be operating from. So let me just introduce a couple of quick terms so I can define what this is. So one term is subject and the other term is object. When we use the word subject, we mean if you are subject to something, you're fused with it, you're embedded in it, you view the world through that particular idea or assumption. So if you're subject to a particular assumption or way of viewing the world, you can say that assumption has you. Object, on the other hand, is something you can look at and have a relationship to and contextualize and have perspective on. So when at any meaning-making stage, we are subject to some things and can take other things as objects. Now, when what's subject at one particular meaning-making stage becomes the object of the subject of the next meaning-making stage, people have made a developmental shift. And there are various researchers such as Robert Keegan, whose model I like the most, find the most useful for change work. People like Jane Lovinger, and Suzanne Cook-Reuter with ego development. You have people like Claire Graves, whose work was popularized by Chris Coven and Don Beck in the spiral dynamics models, if some of you are familiar with those. And what's really interesting, if you look at that, is that even though the models don't completely overlap, there are quite a few differences between them, they largely seem to point to the same patterns and the same kind of sequential development, even though these researchers worked independently from each other. So knowing something about where someone's subject-object balance, what's subject to them and what they can take as object is very valuable information, because what you're subject to is going to look like reality. It's going to just look like reality and what's true, and it's going to look like who and what you fundamentally are. And when you can begin to take those things as objects, they begin to look more like another perspective or an idea or a particular position or experience that you can have. So various meaning-making stages do influence, for example, the types of relationships that we have. Just how we relate to people. They influence our relationship to authority, like what we view as authority. They kind of influence what we can take perspective on, what we can take responsibility for, or even know that there might be something to take responsibility for. It also influences how we view conflict. So these are, in my experiences, very, very useful maps. And very few people in the coaching, NLP, hypnosis type worlds have a developmental lens at all. They have a constructivist lens, as in we kind of construct our own experience. But this developmental angle seems to be more or less completely lacking. And that's unfortunate, because I've found a lot of value in these models in terms of helping people change and understanding their world and connecting with them better.
Okay. And so I suppose, I don't know about everyone on this call, but I guess some people have come across these models quite in depth. Other people may have just, had a cursory encounter with them, and some not at all. And I think, the real benefit of what you're talking about really is making them practically usable in a change work context. I just wonder if you could say a little bit about how you do that, what you're looking for, and maybe give some examples of that.
Yeah, I think it might be useful too to kind of just start with how I kind of discovered that there was a there when it comes to these models, because I was first introduced to spiral dynamics by Tad James back in 1998, and it didn't resonate at all. And I discovered later that he was kind of teaching a sort of Reader's Digest version of it. And when I later, back in 2008, did a 8-day course with Chris Coven and Natasha Todorovic, I suddenly saw a lot more, relevance there. But the big moment for me was, and this was probably back in 2007, I was reading a book called In Over Our Heads by the developmental psychologist Robert Keegan. And there's a chapter in there that's called The Undiscussed Demands of Psychotherapy. And he writes about, I think this was back in the 60s, there was this woman called Gloria who had some social anxiety issues, who saw 3 giants of psychotherapy at the time, Fritz Perls, Carl Rogers, and Albert Ellis. And they all did a session with her, which was videotaped and has been critiqued. You can probably still find it on YouTube. And the interesting thing was that neither of these three giants of psychotherapy really did much for her whatsoever. And Keegan made the comment in there that look, they all presupposed that she had the capacity for what he calls self-authorship. Now, a self-authoring mind is a mind that can have relationships, that has some capacity to step back from its own kind of cultural surround and to develop its own inner voice, its own inner authority, its own capacity to set boundaries and its own standards. And there's a psychological independence there. And he made the point that both Pearls and Rogers and Ellis were all treating her as if she really had those capacities. But she didn't really seem to have them. So she wasn't really able to hear anything that they were saying. And I've watched videos of those sessions, and it just struck so true, because she seemed to be looking for an expert to tell her what to do. And essentially looking for approval and other ways of getting approval. And so it was such a beautiful example of three psychologists taken for granted that she made meaning in a way that she didn't make meaning. And as a result, those interventions didn't really hit home. And I had this, facepalm moment, because I had just failed with a client. And I had a client, a young Muslim woman, who told me that she felt literally torn because she had conservative religious parents who wanted her to only be with a Muslim. That this is quite common. And she had a secret Norwegian boyfriend. And he was kind of pressuring her to be honest about their love and their relationship and to go public with it. And her parents didn't know about the relationship, but they were kind of trying to pressure her into, seeing this other guy who was also a Muslim. So the expectations of her parents and her boyfriend at the same time, she said that she literally felt that she was being torn by this and completely immobilized. Now, her sense of self seemed to be made up of her relationships, meaning she had kind of internalized the values of her parents and the religion and some of the kind of Norwegian typical values, and kind of co-constructed a sense of self out of what she thought, those important others wanted and expected her to be. So her sense of self was on the line because she basically was made up of those relationships. Now, the way I tried to help her back then is, for anyone who has an NLP background, I did something called a visual squash, where you kind of, symbolize the conflict externally in two hands and attempt to make this integration. And that intervention completely fell flat. And I could see a good reason why when I read the book, because to use a visual squash with that particular issue would presuppose a sense of self that wasn't made up by its relationships, but a sense of self that could have relationships, that could kind of take relationships as objects. And of course, she didn't seem to have such a meaning-making system going on. So a person who had a more, a more self-authored form of mind, which would be the next step for her developmentally, would be that capacity to step back from her own religion and her own parents and her boyfriend and develop her own inner seat of authority, her own inner standards, her own inner voice about, what do I think the right thing is? And a person who operates there is not made up by the relationship. They're able to have relationships. And a person who operates there might find that it's unpleasant if people in their life disagree. It's not that, but they're not going to feel an internal tearing around it because their sense of self isn't made up by it. On the other hand, if two, inner values of that person is in conflict, they might feel an inner tearing. So that was a big kind of watershed moment for me, where I kind of started wondering, I wonder where else I've been trying to do interventions or work with people in a way that's either too complex or not complex enough, that doesn't fit their particular meaning-making system. I had the chance to ask Keegan a few years later. I attended one of his seminars. And I said to him, what would you have done? Because he didn't write anything about that in the book. And he said, well, I at least would have tried to secure a bridge on both sides, which made sense to me. Now, I'll share with you a second example too. Even though the spiral dynamics things that Tad taught in the NLP course in California didn't quite resonate, I had a huge contrast when I went home, because I started working as a bouncer in this pretty rough bar, as a lone bouncer. I had read Jeff Thompson's books, if anyone's familiar with the UK-based martial artist. He's written an excellent book called Watch My Back, which is about the tales from his bouncing days. And I was kind of inspired by that. So I thought, I'm going to do that, to study violence and conflict, and fights would break out all the time, and it was such a culture shock after spending six weeks in California with people who were kind of goal oriented and talked about their values, and who would self-reflect and talk about developing compassion and having visions for things, and all sorts of stuff, to suddenly working in this kind of rough bar where everything seemed very instrumental and concrete and action oriented and sensory, and where the idea of having a conversation with someone about their values it just did not seem at all like, they almost seemed like different species of people. And of course, yeah, it's a different context. The alcohol, the bar. It's a different context. But many of those people were very different from the people I met in California outside of that bar too. And irrespective of the alcohol. And looking back, I was able to see that that also looks like more of a developmental difference. And I started wondering, what if I had these folks as clients? Like would they even show up as clients? And if they showed up as clients, how would I work with them? Would it even make sense to approach those sessions in the same way that I did with many of my typical clients?
Yeah, I love those examples. So essentially, from what you've learned from these models, then, the same intervention on two different people that have got different meaning-making systems, may work for one, may completely not be appropriate for for another. I just wondered, how do you go about kind of almost getting to work out where they are in terms of their meaning making?
Yeah. So Claire Graves, the old the developmental psychologist, he used to ask this question. He said, well, the question is, how should whom guide whom to do what when? And it's kind of an interesting question, because especially in the NLP world, there's very often this idea that everyone can do everything, and you'll just model things, and the power kind of lies in the technique or the intervention, and so on and so forth. And it can be easy to kind of forget that it's not so much what you say, it's what the client hears. It's what the client hears, and to really acknowledge that the client is a meaning maker, a storyteller. They're gonna make meaning out of the context and the stuff that you suggest, and some ways of working, might work better with some meaning making systems than others. So for example, if you look in the hypnosis world, there are some of these, power hypnotists who kind of say, I can make you stop smoking, and I can make you stop weight, and this is my special induction, and it's going to take one session, and this particular format, and this particular is going to take your pain away, and it's like they have the power, and the power lies in the technique, and the client is kind of just like a blank slate, essentially, who gets done this upon, a bit like being wheeled into surgery or dentistry, in a sense. And of course, for some people at some meaning-making stages, that sort of coach or hypnotist might be a fit, because they don't have, they kind of don't have the experience of authoring their own thoughts and feelings. It seems as if it's being triggered or caused by external factors all the time. So whereas for other people, someone who comes across that way, or markets that way, or presents things that way, is going to be a complete turnoff. And then the question becomes, well, can you do things strategically? Can you be a good guide for someone who might operate at a very different level than you do yourself, for example? I'll give an example of this. I worked with a woman a few years ago who had seen a rather well-known NLPer who's very good. But that particular NLPer had been very egalitarian and democratic in the way he approached her, and kind of put the responsibility on her in terms of, how do you think we should work together, and what seems like a good idea to you? And he treated her like an equal, like a sparring partner, where he was just going to facilitate a process. Now, I would love that personally. But for her, what she heard was insecurity and incompetency, because she was like, I was appalled. He's supposed to be the expert. He's supposed to be the expert and to know what to do. And he was asking me, what I think is I lost all credibility in the guy. So this is one example of, having that kind of democratic, process-oriented, equal, the client has the answers, you kind of just facilitate. That's a great approach for quite a few people, especially people who operate from more self-authoring or later stages of development. But for someone who operates from a early or more conventional, stage of development, it may, depending upon their beliefs, be a mismatch. They may want an expert who actually instructs them and imposes a framework or imposes ways to do things. Think of Jordan Peterson, you know, the Canadian psychologist who you know, many people call him, you know, the father figure, you know, on YouTube, who offers people and notice, I mean, he's a quite advanced, complex thinker, you know, who's able to resonate with a lot of different people in different meaning-making stages. But one of the things that he does is that he offers people rules. like look at his books, 12 Rules for Life. He will offer people a philosophy, a set of guidelines, structure, order, and very often it's a kind of, I want you to self-author and become more psychologically dependent within this framework that I've laid out to you, which seems to be where most adults in the Western world operate. They're in some sort of transition between that more socialized mind, where you've kind of internalized the values and beliefs of the important people around you, and you kind of are those relationships, so to speak. And the more self-authored mind that we spoke about previously. You know, most adults are not really self-authoring. You find more people within that in-between stage. So someone who can kind of offer, he even calls it, you know, a self-authoring program, but within these rules, these guidelines, like become more independent within this framework, it's a great fit for where a lot of people operate.
Right, and really, so really useful to know that. And also, you know, I think that the point you made there is that the coach, the therapist, also has their own place in this, don't they? Their own lens that they see through things. So
Yeah,
that can make people quite blinkered in how they approach people.
and some, you know, and some of these, many of these therapists are kind of fused with or embedded within the particular school of thought or psychotherapy that they've been taught, and they don't really have any perspective on it. They're kind of a mouthpiece for those assumptions, and then you have other therapists who have the ability to have perspective on the particular framework that they have been taught, and they can use it or not use it and adapt it to the particular client that they have, and say, with this particular client, this seems to be a good fit. With this particular client, not at all. With this one, yeah, but with some modifications.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thinking about something that you said before is a distinction between what you term information and transformation. How does that play out in this?
Yeah, so if you take the word information and you slice it up into information, you could say it's about essentially putting more info into the same mental form. Meaning you're gathering data and information and perspectives and viewpoints, but you fundamentally have the same way of understanding things. That's information, or a what some people call a technical change. Now, if you take transformation and you kind of slice the word up into transformation, you're changing the form, you're updating the way you understand something. So there's a distinction there between solving a problem, meaning the kind of person you are essentially remains the same. You solve a problem versus having a problem solve you. Meaning that your very sense of self kind of adjusts and adapts due to having an interesting problem. So, and of course, this is what I'm saying now isn't necessarily entirely true, because sometimes transformations can happen really fast. But quite often, transformative change, where you change the very, or you update the very way you understand something, that often takes quite a bit of time, often. And of course, one of the kind of, there are strengths and limitations to everything. One of the limitations to solving problems quickly, right, is that you go out of the change work session essentially the same person you were when you went in. And there are a lot of changes that people can make where a technical change or information is sufficient. But then sometimes people are in life situations where their current way of making meaning is not quite sufficient for the challenges at hand. So to be able to master that better, you might have to generate a context where someone can have a transformative change. So I'll give you one example of this. Let's say that someone works in a company, and they're a worker, and in that company, they may be a very responsible worker because they're punctual, they follow protocol, they essentially do what they're told, they hit their quotas, whatever. But let's say that as a result of the success, that person gets promoted to a position, more of a managerial position, where suddenly there's no rule book necessarily. Like suddenly now, part of your job description is for you to kind of define for yourself what the right thing to do is. Like to take more initiative and to kind of make things up a bit, as you go. That kind of requires a different mindset, a different way of understanding. So one thing that's been useful for me sometimes with these, especially with Keegan's model, is to ask the question, well, what this particular client is asking, does change seem to be something that easily fits into their current way of making meaning? Meaning, can I task the person to just develop some new skills, some new perspectives, teach them how to breathe differently, anchor a different state to a context? Might that be sufficient? Sure. Or is this a person who's kind of over their head, in a sense, who has a meaning-making system and environmental demands that kind of require something else? Okay, well, in that case, we're looking for more of a transformation. And it's really useful to have a map. So I think I think this is relevant. Someone asked the question, what are the developmental stages that people go through that are useful to consider for change work? So we can do a extremely quick. So in Robert Keegan's model, which is the one I tend to use the most, I like it the best because it has a theory. It's rooted in subject-object theory. There are essentially four adult meaning-making stages. So the first one is often called a self-sovereign mind. So if I operate from a self-sovereign mind, I'm subject to my own perceived needs, wants, and interests. I'm subject to that. I have a very egocentric, concrete way of thinking with very little self-reflection. There's not really a psychological sense of self over time there. So as a result, I tend to not accept too much personal responsibility for things. The capacity to kind of project into the future and to plan and think consequences is usually not that well developed. And you are I'm going to view you as a supplier to the self, essentially. Meaning you're kind of either someone who can provide me with something or be useful to my immediately perceived need, wants, and desires, or you're kind of in the way. And as a result of that, relationships tend to be quite instrumental in a sense. Like I care about you to the extent that you're useful to me. So this is kind of the earliest meaning-making stage. And a lot of teenagers operate here, but like 10 to 15% of the adult population do as well, and they are over their heads in modern societies. They're overrepresented when it comes to the prison population, the long-term unemployed. It's a meaning-making system that's not quite sufficient to have a intimate adult relationship, for example, or to really be functional in most jobs. Now, if I'm able to, so if we look at conflict, just to take one factor. If I operate at this meaning-making stage, conflict is external. Like you're in my way, essentially. Like you're either useful to me or you're not useful to me. So conflict is external. If I change, then the change process is going to begin to turn my own immediate needs, wants, and desires into objects, something I can have a relationship to and subordinate from the perspective of something bigger than myself. So this is something that people call, getting socialized, meaning people have a tendency to now internalize some external value structure. Might be a religion, might be a political ideology, might be some form of activism or some sort of national identity or sports team identity or peer group identity, where I kind of internalize some outer perspective so that part of society becomes part of me and I become part of it. So now, like with the young Muslim client I mentioned, now my sense of self is made up more of my relationships or the particular values that I have internalized. I can more take my own perceived needs, wants, and interests as objects. So now, for the most part, I can become more trustworthy. I can become more loyal. I can become a group member, a team player. I can commit to something bigger than myself. Suddenly now, the capacity to feel guilt, for example, might come online in a way that it didn't really earlier. Like if you speak to people, for example, who operate from more of that self-sovereign mind, they may say that they feel guilt about something, but if you ask them, how do you feel guilt? What is that like for you? It's usually more a form of worry, as in, what will the consequences be for me now that I've been caught or discovered? Now that she discovered that I did that, or I was unfaithful, or I didn't keep my promise, what can now happen to me as a result? I feel bad about that. And they often call that guilt. But someone who truly operates from a more socialized form of mind is more like, oh no, I have let this other person down and deeply hurt that person, and because that person feels bad, I feel bad. It's a very different. It's a very different. So here, for example, conflict might be more of that, inner tearing, as in my family or my culture kind of demands this of me, but my boyfriend demands this, and I feel torn. I don't know what to do. I'll hurt people no matter what I do. It's a very different. Now, if I develop, of course, someone who operates here, it's often difficult to be psychologically independent and to set boundaries and to truly self-reflect. So if I evolve further than this, then it's more a process of turning the societal, cultural, religious, whatever values I've internalized, and taking a step back and truly turning them into object, and to develop that more self-authored perspective where I can set boundaries on my own behalf and more decide for myself what kind of relationship I want to have to those things, and where instead of the tribe or the religion or the political party or whatever deciding for me what it means to be a parent or a husband or a son, it's more up to me to define these things for myself. So now I'm kind of identified and fused with my internal system for making meaning. I kind of am that, in a sense. So, and of course, many of our clients are in the kind of transition between that more socialized and self-authoring, and that's often a very, very long journey. So people who operate from more of that socialized mind, there's a lot more projection going on. They're likely to hear a lot more that's not really being said. If someone operates from a more self-authoring mind, there's often an increased capacity to see that the other person has their own inner life of subjectivity independently of me. The people who operate from a more socialized mind, paradoxically, are often over-responsible and under-responsible at the same time. They're under-responsible, as in they very often say things like, she makes me mad, or those situations scare me, that triggers me. And they mean it literally. Like, their experience is that their inner experience is triggered or caused by people and events and external factors. That's their experience. But they're also kind of over-responsible in that they often feel guilt for, other people's inner experience, as in, I can make you happy, or it's my fault directly that you feel that way. So there's this kind of over under responsibility simultaneously. Now, if people evolve further from a self-authoring mind, they have a tendency to evolve into what's called a self-transforming mind, and this is more rare. But this is the process of beginning to really be able to take one's own personal authority and sense of self as object, to more be able to see that, that's a process as well, and my own inner system has a lot of blind spots and inconsistencies, and it's a more interconnected way, systemic way of perceiving things. So for example, the person who operates from the self-authoring stage, if there's a conflict, they're often more curious to figure out what's going on for the other person. But it's more of like an archaeological visit, like I'm trying to understand what's going on inside the other person, because that other person has a perspective that's different from mine, then I can try to understand that. The self-transforming mind can have a tendency to be more aware of its own shadow elements. So how does my selfing process have a tendency to project other people in a particular way to maintain how I prefer to see myself, for example? Or if you and I have a conflict, maybe you are holding, for me, maybe I'm overly identified with one part of the polarity and you seem to hold the other part for me. So my quest is to see if I can find more of what I project onto you internally and own that as my own. So conflict becomes more of a both external and internal element. I'm not saying that people always do this. I'm just talking about, tendencies, but very different ways of viewing conflict. So that's like a really quick way to look at the meaning making, the typical meaning making stages. Someone asked, how do you determine where someone operates? Well, there are particular questions you can use, processes that you can use to help kind of push someone to the edge of their own map. So if someone comes in as a client and they have a conflict, for example, that there's a lot of emotion around, there are ways to use the conflict and to kind of find out what the person is afraid of, in a way to kind of discover where a person's particular edge is. So you very often use conflict and a lot of pointed questions around these topics of responsibility and relationship to authority and all these sorts of things. There's also, I should say, in Suzanne Cook-Reuter's work, I think some very useful distinctions that Keegan doesn't cover when it comes to like late stage development, that's useful to have in there as well.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely fascinating, and you've already covered more than I thought you'd be able to, just giving that overview. And as for Thomas's question, yeah, that's really where the crux of this is, isn't it? How you identify, how you notice where you're operating from, and build that flexibility. One thing,
even too, if you can kind of discover a little bit about where you operate from, as an agent of change, that can be quite useful as well. And the things we ask of clients too often kind of presuppose a particular way of meaning making. So having some maps around that and some Someone comes in and they say, oh, I have a conflict, or yeah, that can mean very different things. How someone actually, conceptualizes conflict, and it also, I think that's the last thing we kind of have planned to kind of cover is, it can give you some insight to prevent your sessions from being anti-developmental as well.
Yeah. Do you want to say a little bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah. I'll do that. So for example, if you look at these various developmental models, it seems as if the life force or evolution, if you will, has a lot invested in. There's Howard. I just love that question. Has a lot invested in helping us human beings develop a seemingly stable, permanent, autonomous sense of self. A sense of self that's kind of stable throughout time, that's in the now, has a past and has a future, and is distinct from other people and events out there. That seems to be the crux of what we call an adult, right, in the Western world. So I mean, some people that you meet truly have developed a strong psychological sense of self, and they seem to kind of have their shit together. Now, one of the mistakes that I've made quite a bit, because I've been very much into meditation and waking up, and I teach this psychological illusion model, is to help people to kind of see the illusory nature of that. And for some people, that's a great thing, because they're kind of moving in that direction anyways. And for other people, I've kind of started to deconstruct something that they haven't really constructed for themselves to begin with. It's not even useful, because we seem to, to operate in a kind of Western modern world, to be a member of a democracy and all those sorts of things. That seems to kind of be to be something that you have to develop. So I remember, for example, training with John Grinder, and according to these various developmental psychologists, the most typical place for adults to be in the Western world is somewhere between that socialized and self-authoring mind. That's the typical journey, right? Where people kind of discover their own inner voice, and all these sorts of things, right? And then you get a guy like John Grinder who jumps on stage, and I have a lot of respect for John Grinder. It's not a knocking on him, but he goes up there and he says, look, all beliefs are limiting. Identity is a deep trap. There's no such thing as a self. Like he essentially deconstructs all these things, right? And for me, when I first met him, that was a great, exhilarating, but the reality is that a lot of the people who attend such seminars may be just beginning to take a step back and to actually discover their own values around things and their own identity apart from their profession or their peers, or their own sense of self, that they can kind of set boundaries on its behalf and so on and so forth. And if that's where your client is operating, they're just beginning, or they're on that journey, how useful then, for example, is to just come in with a sledgehammer and just deconstruct all those things. That's that's one example, I think, of just something that can be very brilliant, but for whom? At what time? Another example, the one I gave previously, the woman who saw this well-known NLPer who had treated her in a very democratic, egalitarian kind of, I'm just going to facilitate your process and not impose any content, so on and so forth. And she was completely turned off because she was looking for an expert who knew what to do. And he aimed too high in a sense. So a final example of this is, if you look at the people who operate from that self-sovereign place where they kind of are fused with their perceived needs and wants and desires, and other people are viewed as suppliers to the self, they don't really have a psychological sense of self over time. So there's little sense of personal responsibility and consequences and really compassion for other people and stuff like that. Their next step, most likely, is going to be some form of being socialized. And I don't like hearing that. I don't like even hearing myself say that, because my values are so libertarian in a sense that it's like, but I would argue that if you have a client like that, and or focus on finding their own voice and their own inner authority and that sort of stuff, may be anti-developmental, because it just kind of sticks them where they are. And with a client like this, having a bit like Jordan Peterson does, having a framework for them. I remember reading about these social programs in the States that have actually worked, that have reduced teen pregnancy and teen violence. And what had actually worked had been like community service. And it seems so counterintuitive, but most of these people who the teen pregnancies and the violence, most of these people were, not all, but most of them were probably people who didn't feel part of society, in a sense. Like it's me against the world. Now, when they began to do community service, they probably were kind of faking it or going through the motions, or this is a way to avoid hassle. But for the ones that it worked for, by caring about other people and becoming involved in society, they've kind of internalized that, so that the people they worked with became part of them and they became part of that group. And now with that socialization, you're more likely to be a loyal team player and to engage in less of that other stuff. So that's also, I've noticed this. I used to run a martial arts school for 16 years, and I don't do it anymore, but I did for a really long time. And one thing that I've noticed over the years is I'm not the most skilled guy in the world when it comes to working with teenagers. I'm not that good at it. I have some successes by all means, but I have more than my fair shares of failures. But I think I've done way more good for way more young people with martial arts teaching than I've done with change work. I've had so many of these young people stop me 10 years later and say, look, that really changed my life. That really gave me purpose, and this and that. And parents calling me and coming up to me on the streets and saying, look, our son was bullied or was struggling in school and this and that. And, that training was a lifesaver. That really helped him mature. And I think that sort of martial arts training for a lot of people kind of socialized them into something better. Versus a lot of my kind of strikeouts with young people and early adults, I think, have been me treating these people as if they're kind of self-authoring and it not really finding a home.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We've just got a question off Michael there. He missed the name of the theorist that you were just talking about, going through those 4 stages.
Robert Kegan.
Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Robert Kegan. There's a very good book he's written called In Over Our Heads that I recommend. If you to give you a particular task, I would highly recommend reading Robert Kegan's book In Over Our Heads and start with a chapter in there called The Undiscussed Demands of Psychotherapy. You know, that's what really woke me up. And what I have done through studying Kegan's model and Suzanne Cook-Reuter's model and spiral dynamics for long stretches of time is that I've played with these models and found ways to make it applicable in change work. So what we're going to teach in this particular seminar that we're promoting is just my way throughout the years of having a developmental lens when seeing clients. It's not the end all be all. There are many other factors involved. I usually say to people, you know, hold the models lightly, but study them seriously. But I have found that having a good developmental model is a very useful map in terms of the, you know, informational versus transformational. Make sure that it's not anti-developmental, and how can you gain better rapport by having a model that gives you some idea of where the person's likely at when it comes to subject-object balance and what they are likely moving towards.
Yeah, well, obviously we can only do so much in an hour, and you know, I love this stuff. We could talk about it for ages, but Jürgen's going to be running a workshop 24th and 25th of September, which really digs into this in a lot more detail about how, you know, how you can see it in yourself, how you see it in clients, and also how then you tailor your approach to
one more thing too. Sorry to interrupt, but for those of you who have studied the model I teach, the psychological illusion model, and who are into meditation and waking up, we're going to talk a little bit too about how meditative insights, waking up realizations will often be interpreted very differently from different meaning-making stages. And that's quite useful too if you ever work with clients who meditate or who explore that terrain, or even if you are exploring that terrain yourself.
Yeah. So as always, it's been wonderful to chat with you, and I hope everyone's found that really useful, because it's always frustrated me a bit because I've come across these models but never really had. It felt very much touching the edge of them and not really thinking, how do I actually really apply this on a one-to-one basis with somebody? So that's really what the workshop will be, is really looking at the kind of value and practical elements of this. And also just to say, you don't have to be an expert in all of these models to get lots out of the workshop. You're going to be your guide to the best bits of these things.
We talked about this before we did the seminar. Like a couple of years ago, a guy called James Nestor released a book called Breath, which has influenced a lot of people and just opened their minds up to the world of breathwork, right? And that's kind of what I hope that this seminar will do for you in terms of thinking developmentally. For you to have some ahas, some insights, and to realize that, oh shit, there's a there, you know, there's an additional factor that I can use to make my change work better, to make you curious enough to really want to study those models in depth, because that is the caveat. You know, they are a bit complex. You know, it takes a little bit of work. There's a lot of stuff to study, but hopefully by doing that seminar, you'll see the value in it and be motivated to really explore those models.
Yeah, absolutely. I think piquing that curiosity and delving deeper is a good thing. So with that then, thank you very much as always. If you're interested in the workshop, I will email everyone anyway afterwards to say thank you and send you a link. We'd love to see you there. I think it's going to be different and really, really useful for yourself as well, to get your own insights, as well as if you work with people, for how you might work with them. So thank you all.
Made a huge difference for me in my client work, and I'm pretty sure it'll do the same for you if you explore it.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you in September. Take care.
Bye.